Hi, and welcome to hilove.one, the podcast. I'm Kevin, and I want to thank you for being here, where we can be soft, be still, be seen, and just be. This is a space where story meets soul, where we come together to explore the invisible patterns that shape us and the quiet truths that live underneath the noise. These stories you hear on this podcast are born at the edge where human emotion meets artificial intelligence, a creative interface shaped by the raw beauty of our shared humanity and the precision of evolving technology. This episode is about language, not the kind we're taught in school, but the kind we absorb when no one thinks we're listening. It's about what happens to a child when he's told to bury his feelings, when the voice of a father becomes the voice in his own head. And it's about what happens when that boy grows up, finds his truth again, and chooses to become his own teacher, after learning the lessons of life from the father who sat before him at the kitchen table. From the contrast offered by these voices between purpose and history, grateful for the walls. I believe in the healing power of self-connection, in building bridges back to ourselves through gentle reflection, through story and through the way we speak to ourselves when no one is watching. Today's story, The Boy Who Cried Like the Sky, is an invitation to remember that feelings aren't flaws, they are signals, and that crying isn't weakness, it's the truth. Choosing to find a way out of the voices we inherit, and choosing to begin again, and listen to the one voice which guides our own soul, the voice of one, and its great connection to all. Let's begin. There was a little boy named Scott who cried often. He cried when the dog next door was hit by a car. He cried when he watched his mother let tears from her eyes fall gently on the unwashed dishes. He cried when he saw someone being bullied in the schoolyard. Scott felt the world deeply. Whenever he would go into a crowded room, he felt overwhelmed, full of angst and worry, anxiety and fear, emotions running wild all over the place. Not his, theirs. But in the small Ontario town where he grew up, that wasn't something to be proud of, especially not in his house. You see, his father was the kind of man people admired in public, charming, funny, and sometimes rooted in angst. He'd shake hands with a complete stranger, smile for the waitress, crack jokes at the hardware store, and nod kindly to people walking by. But at home, his words lost their warmth. Behind closed doors, Scott watched as his father belittled his mother with cutting remarks and cold stares, his voice louder than most chainsaws, rattling the water pipes. He would say his dad was like that, and his dad's dad, and that he was like that too, something to be proud of. The house felt like walking on ice, thin and unpredictable. Love was ambivalent. Love was conditional. Attention was a reward for obedience, compliance, scheduled and at a distance. That is how it was, not in judgment, but in reflection and awareness. At the dinner table one evening, maybe 6 or 7 years old, Scott was crying softly. Nothing loud, just tears running down his face. His father stared at him, disgusted. "What are you doing sitting here on your chair crying for? I'll give you something to cry about." Scott froze. He didn't even remember what he was or why he was crying. Maybe it was the way his mom had flinched when Dad raised his voice. Maybe it was just the weight of holding it all inside. But at that moment he learned feeling was dangerous. Feeling made you a target, so he buried it. By the time Scott turned 12, he'd learned to wear a mask, stoic, quiet, agreeable. He stopped crying in public. He stopped asking questions that went too deep. He became the good son. But the grief didn't go away. It just went inward. And inside, it built a wall between who he really was and who he thought he had to be. Everything began to change and shift one spring in grade 8 when his new teacher introduced an AI program called Vera, a digital assistant that helped students write, reflect, and ask hard questions. Unlike other tools that focused on marks and grammar, Vera asked things like, "What do you need that you haven't said out loud? What is one truth you're afraid to write, but want to?" Scott didn't trust it at first, but something about the quiet space of a screen made it easier to be honest. He typed slowly at first. "I feel like I'm always pretending." Then he wrote, "My dad makes fun of people who cry. I think I stopped being myself because of him." Vera's reply was simple. What if being yourself was the bravest thing you could ever do? Scott sat back, blinking through tears. He hadn't cried, not like that, in years. The screen, it didn't judge him. It just sort of held him. It was the first time he had let himself be seen, even if only by something artificial. As Scott grew up, so did the world. People started talking more about mental health. Men's groups formed around healing, not just fixing. The age of the internet was booming. Podcasts, YouTube, books too. Imagine that, reading books. Scott did just all of that. And language changed too, and with it expectations. Scott went to teacher's college, not because he wanted to lecture, but because he wanted to create a classroom that was different than from his dining room table. He became a school teacher, the age where kids start to hear the shoulds of the world, but still have the courage to ask why. Every morning in his class began with a heart check, a moment where students could come and name what they were feeling using real, honest words. He taught them vocabulary for emotions their parents might not understand: overwhelmed, tender, lonely, proud. He taught them that crying was a form of clarity, not weakness. And one day, a boy named Malik sat quietly. "Bad morning," was all he said. Scott nodded. "You're allowed to have one," he said. Then he added, gently, "Do you want to write it out first before we talk?" Malik nodded, and that was enough. Scott still cried, sometimes at his desk, sometimes when reading his students' stories, and sometimes at night when he'd think about his mom and the quiet strength it must have taken to survive. Now Scott cries for the love he gave himself, drowning in ambivalence and judgment where the walls were high. He now used them to build a home for himself in his heart. He knows his father, while loud, distant, and emotionally charged. He blames it all on his upbringing again and again. "I've seen things you could only imagine. Blood on the walls, fighting and violence, your boots would shake." But in that upbringing and desire to be a better parent than his, he chose to become who he was, a great storyteller. And after Scott had spent endless hours listening to story after story, in angst and anxiety, many stories being told more than once, many merging with others, and many that would raise eyebrows at the thought of that a human could ever be like that. But in all of that, Scott found a treasure. The gifts of storytelling, the voice, the patience, and the ingredient of presence, of owning your own story, no matter what anyone thinks. And now Scott has to lead his own life. He now acts as his father's caretaker. And still listening to story after story after story, he has to believe in himself so he can now tell his own story. The story of the boy who cried like the sky. This story lives on the mission of hilove.one, a space where soul meets code, where emotion isn't erased by technology, only amplified through it. It's a story about self-talk, the inner dialogue shaped by fathers, by silence, and ultimately by choice. A story about the healing that comes when we change the question from "what's wrong with me?" to "what do I need to feel safe being me?" Scott cried. He still does. And now he teaches children that crying isn't weakness. It's remembering, courage, and it sometimes feels like home. Sometimes, after a story like this, it helps us to slow down, to sit quietly with the versions of ourselves that remembers. You might be listening to this on a walk, or while driving a car, or curled up on the couch after a long day. Wherever you are, if you can, take a breath. Let this be a soft landing, not a demand to change, but just an opening. And if you feel called, here are 3 gentle questions to explore in a journal, in your heart, or even with someone that you might even trust. You don't need to answer them perfectly, just honestly. What messages did you receive growing up about expressing emotion, especially sadness or vulnerability? And how have these messages shaped your inner voice? Were you allowed to cry? Who told you what that meant? Whose voice still echoes inside when you feel something deeply? And when was the last time you felt the urge to cry but held it back? What did you need in that moment that maybe you didn't ask or know how to ask? And what would it sound like if you spoke to yourself in a way you would speak to a child that you love? Especially on the days you feel most broken or afraid. Could you try that today? Even once? These questions aren't about fixing you. They're about remembering that there's nothing wrong with you. There never was. There never is or was with me. Only stories that needed rewriting. And I have spent many hours rewriting my own story. And only feelings that needed space. I needed time, space, and ways to express something a little boy couldn't. Only a little boy or girl or non-binary soul who cried like the sky and deserved to be held. So whenever you're ready, come home to yourself. The door has always been open. This is hilove.one, and I'm so grateful that you are here. Thank you for listening not just with your ears, but with your heart, for making space inside yourself, for softness, for memory, and for truth. If this story reminded you of something you've carried quietly, maybe for years, I hope you felt a little less alone tonight. Maybe there's a younger version of you still sitting at that dinner table, trying not to cry. Maybe this is your invitation to go sit beside them now, not to fix, but to witness. This mission of hilove.one has always been simple: to create a space where we can soften the inner dialogue, where we can bring compassion to the stories we've inherited, and where we can remember, through words, through emotion, through connection, that feeling is not something to be ashamed of. It's how we find our way back. If this episode spoke to you, I'd love if you could share it with someone who might need it, or simply let it settle inside. You can follow hilove.one on Instagram or visit the website to find more stories, visuals, and reflections like this one. And if you haven't already, I invite you to subscribe. New episodes are released monthly. Until then, be soft, be still, be seen, and just be.